I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody.
Good morning. I'm Lynn Adams, and I welcome you all. We're going to have a little different service this morning because we have a special guest who's going to get us ready for our transition that we are going to be going through. We're going to omit our first hymn, but we'll sing at the end. And we're going to start with our brief joys and concerns, and then we will have announcements in our dining room when we eat our food afterwards, and so that we have a kind of can get through our service here, we're going to ask you that if you have joys and concerns to make them brief, and we can talk later about them. So, do we have any joys and concerns? Good. I didn't mean to scare you off completely. Good.
Anita Kamek. I just wanted to report to everybody that we had a really great turnout yesterday for our outside cleanup day. We got a lot done. Craig was here and had all the boxwoods trimmed before I even got here, about 8:15. So that was a huge help. And then we had lots of people. We had the Blackers and the Gosses and the Smiths and Linda Lynn and Cindy Vidal and Mary Dooley and Josiah and I can't see, and April, and then also and me, and then also I just want to mention that Sally and Debbie's efforts before the cleanup were very helpful as well. They had done a lot of work prior. So I just want to, say thank you to everybody for coming out. We spruced up some of the flattened things that happened during the roofing project, and hopefully everything will look pretty before our bicentennial. So thank you.
Any other joys and concerns? See, I'm afraid I scared you away.
She's a colleague and a friend from First Friends, and she's been joining our writing group, and she decided to join us today.
Great.
And today is writing group at 1 o'clock.
Happy to have you. Oh, sure.
I think last time I was here, I talked about how there's a huge Haitian population in Springfield, Ohio, most of whom have lost their status recently. And in the last couple weeks, the pace of things has really accelerated, and there's a lot of ICE raids happening, people being detained, families being ripped apart. So if you have an interest in getting involved, you're welcome to reach out to me. I'm sure someone can share my contact info, and I'd be happy to connect you, especially if you're a clergy person or a recorded minister or willing to fudge those facts a little bit. It would probably be especially helpful to have your presence in some of those circumstances, because they're really looking for ways to make a moral stand against what's happening.
I forgot to talk to our friends on Zoom. Are there any people on Zoom that have an announcement or concern? Okay. After we have a moment of centering silence, Tom Rockwell, who I think most of you know, who's our Associate Superintendent of Western New York Meeting, is going to start a series on our transition, how we are going to meet this this period of time that we are in. Yes, challenge. So he will take part of our program. Thank you.
Good as Lynn said, I'm Tom Rockwell. I'm the Associate Superintendent at Western Yearly Meeting. And I've also got Myron Guaychayev here from Western Yearly Meeting as well, who's our Youth and Young Adult Minister. And I am here to talk to you about change and some of the challenges of some of the transitions you're going to be facing. Obviously, your change is in large part going to be coming from Phil retiring as your pastor. And as you have probably noticed, you're one of the more thriving congregations, not just in the yearly meeting, but probably among liberal Christians. Generally, Christians in general are kind of struggling with keeping their churches alive these days. And today we're especially going to focus some time in looking at the landscape that you are going to be facing as a means of starting to think about how can we respond as faithfully and successfully as possible to a rapidly changing world. And Myron's getting my slides going here. There it is, thank you. So I know there's always some confusion in this because we're doing things that are different about what we're actually doing, so I wanted to walk you through it a little bit. First, I really appreciate that you are willing to do something different because I know it can be just kind of dissociating for everybody. It can be upsetting to do something very different, disrupt our normal worship patterns, but I do think it's really important because we are just in a world that is changing more rapidly than it ever has before, and it's very valuable for us to pause together and take some time to reflect on how to move forward together. So there's kind of 3 steps just to what we're really doing. We want to learn about the past, we want to learn about today, and we want to decide who we want to be for the future and, discern a path forward for ourselves. For me, learning about the past and today has 2 components. It's both learning about who you are as a church, but also learning about the world, both how it has changed and where it is now. So today we're going to especially focus on learning about just the changes that have happened. And the next time we meet, which will be in September, we're really going to look at your history here. We'll do sort of a meeting timeline together, and you'll have an opportunity to really talk about who you are as Fairfield friends. And as we move forward, we're going to learn much more about who are seekers today that want to be a part of churches and friends meetings, and how do we reach out to them? How does that fit with where we're at? And then how can we make a plan for reaching those new people? A lot of this, so I trained as a interim minister while I was still in seminary, so I'm one of the few Quaker ministers who's especially focused on change and helping meetings through that process. So this has always kind of interested me as a subject. And I've also done a lot of sociological research around religious change. And a lot of this, what I'm going to talk to you about today, comes from a sociologist, Christian Smith, who's at Notre Dame and is kind of the foremost scholar just on how American churches and religiosity has declined, and in his terminology has become obsolete. That's really what he likes to talk about. Essentially just that churches don't really offer anything to what younger generations are looking for, and our goal is to figure out how we can not be that way. Throughout this, I welcome just jump in at any point. This is meant to be a discussion. I will definitely try and pause and give you a chance to jump in, but don't wait for me to pause. I would much prefer that you just jump in and share what you're thinking, what you're feeling, push back on something if you don't like it. And there are some normal reactions I see when I start to talk to people about this. I've probably done this presentation 25 times now. This first part especially, people tend to have the feeling of it makes them very anxious about the situation, it makes them kind of depressed, it makes them kind of hopeless. We will move in a much more positive direction, I assure you, and when we first start addressing some of these things, you may have those reactions. Just remember, there is a lot of hope. You guys are doing a lot of things the right way. You have a lot of advantages. It's just a matter of figuring those things out in the longer term. People often feel a real strong need to push back against what is kind of an overwhelming body of research at this point that churches are in massive decline, and say oh, well, what about these studies showing vitality? Which is fine. There are some studies showing vitality, and it's important for us to look at those too, but there is just an overwhelming body about how much churches are struggling, and I think it's really important for all of us to kind of deeply acknowledge that. And the other important reaction element here is it's really important, and it's our goal, to get to a position where we can encourage one another to lean into change, since it's difficult for us to want to change much of the time, as you've probably experienced in many parts of your life. And if we are going to survive and thrive and be faithful, it's going to involve us encouraging one another and supporting each other through what is often just the anxiety and unease of needing to change. Okay. So at first we're just going to talk a lot about some of the statistics around decline, real briefly, real fast. Does anybody have anything they want to say before we do that? Okay. Like I said, jump in when you feel you need to. All right, Myron. So these are just the statistics from the Quaker side of things. Friends World Committee for Consultation, which, full transparency, my wife works for, keeps the statistics for the Religious Society of Friends, and they say from our most recent census data between 2010 and 2020, 24% of meetings closed, lost 12% of our membership, so pretty marked decline, actually pretty similar to what most mainline churches experience. And that decline has been happening for like the last 70, 80 years. Statistics get a little fudgier as you go back in the past, but it's a long-term trend. Decline is very large. And a big part of that for us is we used to be able to maintain some level of relationship with evangelical friends. In the last 10 years, they've all put out statements basically saying they want nothing to do with any institution that's not like explicitly evangelical. So while on paper there's like 100,000 Quakers in the United States, 33,000 of them are evangelical friends, and they want nothing to do with the rest of us. So that kind of leads to some inflation of how well we're doing. And I also think there's other inflation of statistics. The Statistical Secretary of Western Yearly Meeting will definitely tell you, like, our numbers are inflated, most of our meetings are not reporting correct numbers. And I have looked around at other yearly meetings, and I see a lot of the same things. Philadelphia Yearly Meeting claims they have like 12,000 members, but when I go to most of the meetings, they're pretty small. So I'm very suspicious of the numbers we report in general. So now we're looking at the broader, Christian religious market, let's say, and across all groups, there's just been a total 60% decline in affiliation, so people who are formally a part of a church. And while the lost generation, which is the people right around World War II, they're still at 60% church attendance, the lost generation who was before World War II, 60% of people were formally part of a church. You fast forward to today, only 20% of Gen Z is part of a church. And there used to be a phenomenon where pretty much everybody was less religious in their early life, and then as they got older, they became more religious. That phenomenon has stopped with Gen X and millennials and Gen Z. We're not seeing that. There is no wider trend to, like, as you get older, you get more religious. That's basically just flat now. So the numbers we see in younger generations, and there is like a very marked split with Gen X, Gen Z, millennials, they're just not getting religious in the way that we used to. Next slide. So you see very similar attendance statistics. Older generations, most people attended. Fast forward to today, most younger people do not attend a church. In the 2010s, even for baby boomers and older generations, you just saw a really steep decline. Everybody is attending less, and as you would expect, the average age of an attender in the 70s goes from 47 to more like 60 today. You see a similar jump in clergy. They get much older. So the average attendance of a church in the US, in the 80s was like 137, today it's 65. So most churches are what a lot of us would consider fairly small. All this stuff extends to belief as well. Pretty much everybody used to be fairly certain there was a God. You jump down to the younger generations, much less certainty. Though you will note they're much more certain about there being a God than say they go to church. So belief still fairly significant. From the 1990s, we just see this huge increase in people who consider themselves not religious, and especially people who consider themselves spiritual but not religious. So still a large interest in spirituality, less in being a part of formal communities, religious communities. So this is just some of the mainline churches, which I think we're pretty similar to. All churches are in decline, basically, at this point. There's a few minor exceptions, but for a long time, evangelical churches were not really declining. Over the last 20 years, they're also massively declining. So there are very few exceptions to the decline pattern at this point. We're probably in that 60 to 70% range, but our statistics aren't as good as these other groups, so we don't fully know. But, even the best mainline churches have declined by 50%, but as you see, like Disciples of Christ, closer to 80%, which is pretty scary. And this is just statistics on church closures, which is, we lose 4,500 churches a year. There's still 3,000 plants, so it offsets that number somewhat, but it's still, we lose 1,500 churches every year, and that number is accelerating fairly rapidly. And this is some Catholic school data just to show you other religious institutions. In the 1990s, there were 7,400 schools. That number has basically halved to today. So religious institutions of all sorts really struggling. A big part of this is how people perceive religious institutions, and that perception has gotten much more negative over the last few decades. In the 70s, people had a great perception of churches. You fast forward to the 90s, it's only like half of people have a pretty good perception. You fast forward to today, it's 20%. And there's a huge skyrocketing of people who say, we have no trust in churches at all. That number is reflected among clergy as well. As late as the 80s, actually, younger people had a really strong confidence in clergy. Now, pretty much most people don't trust clergy very much. This is the sad reality. Okay, so that's just some of the raw statistics of people are much less religious, they're not interested in being part of churches, they don't trust churches, they don't trust clergy, and there's a huge constellation of reasons for this. There's no one single issue of why this happened. There's a whole bunch of different convoluted things that all interact with each other, and if you are really interested in this, I really encourage you to read Christian Smith's book, Why Religion Went Obsolete, and in his book he has 40 some different causes that he sees as interlinking. But I have, Myron, if you could go to the next slide, I have very arbitrarily lumped these into sort of 3 big categories of change, and those categories are totally made up. They're just for helping you process them, and within those categories there's probably 10 or 12 things, but I've reduced it to just 4 or 5 just to give you a sense of some of the changes that have happened. All of the changes that happened, not all of them, but the vast majority of them have a really good side, and then they have the bad side as well. So these things are not just bad things that have caused religion to decline, but they are complex social changes, many of which have had great benefits, but have also had drawbacks for groups like ours. And our goal isn't really to react to them, but instead to just look at how the world has shifted so much from the 1950s to today to get a better sense of who we need to be to appeal to people. Any thoughts, questions, concerns you want to raise before we start on these causes? This will be the majority of what we talk about today.
I just want to say that I attended a kind of little family reunion yesterday. My 2 sons are in their 40s, and their significant others are in their 40s. My grandchildren are 15 and 25, and they were all talking about religion and spirituality And I just wanted to say that to give people hope.
Yes. And so one thing within that I will talk to, and we'll probably talk about more later, but not today, is there is this marked increase, especially in the last few years, in spirituality that is not very well understood. There's a lot of research happening around that right now, but like younger people are having a big resurgence in interest. But there's also all these other parts about religion that they really don't like. So it's kind of like, how can we reach out most effectively to the parts that they are interested in and try to back ourselves out a little bit of the parts that are discouraging for them?
Mary Dooley. I almost would like to suggest another category of communication and media, because it has such strong influence on thinking and how we shape our society, including, if you want to call us a sub-society of churchgoers or what. I don't even like the word churchgoers.
Sure.
But seekers is very important, and I think if we talk about it more, the dialogue could change. But there's a lot of work with media that I think needs to be done.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a ton in there with what you're saying about communication, and I suspect at Fairfield some of that work may be a little bit easier to adapt where people are at, where I work with more conservative churches as well, where like they get a little angsty thinking about adapting to the way the world is communicating about things. So, and there's just, you know, all these different ways where we change how we communicate. Like we communicate much differently because of phones than we did in the past, and we will talk about that a little bit today.
Hi, Sue Walton. Question about Christian nationalism and the rise of Christian schools. Maybe this is a Midwestern thing, a rural thing, versus an urban situation. And I did not see anything about the Unitarians, which is a liberal. Maybe they're not mainstream, but I know their numbers have declined as well. But thoughts on the Christian nationalism, and it, you know, definitely you don't see it in urban areas. As what church do you go to? Here in a suburban area, you are asked. Yeah. You're asked more in the south than you are in the north.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, just briefly to the Unitarians, definitely in decline. They're really struggling. I've talked with a couple of their denominational leaders, and they're seeing all the same stuff. For Christian nationalism, it's like unquestionably a big impact on this. When we talk to younger generations, you see the way that they perceive Christianity to be linked fairly directly for them with Trumpism, with Christian nationalism, with all these kind of nasty things that we are seeing come up in our politics. So it definitely has a huge influence. Again, I would encourage people to read the Christian Smith book, because he gives a really good portrait of how a lot of those things have been happening for the last 50 years and gives just a brief history of some of those things and their impact. I won't talk about it a ton today, but it is a huge impact, unquestionably.
Can you say the name of that book again?
Why Religion Went Obsolete by Christian Smith. And he's great. He has other resources about this as well, and he's writing a book currently that should come out this year about some of that rise in youth spirituality as well, which I'm really looking forward to. Okay, any other questions before we delve into some of the interlinked causes here? Okay, well first, I'm just looking at family, what we'll broadly call family changes. Again, I made up those categories. And one of the biggest changes is women entering the workforce. So I know I grew up in a fairly conservative area, and as late as the 90s, much of the church was being run by stay-at-home moms. It's harder and harder for families to get by with one working parent these days, so we've seen a huge rise in the number of women entering the workforce, and now most households have 2 working families, and people just have much less time from family life to offer to church, so there's fewer volunteers, it's harder to get to an evening activity, harder to participate in general. There's just more pressure on people's lives. I talked about how most of these things have a good side and a bad side. Obviously, women entering the workforce has had innumerable great benefits. Women who've had much more fulfilling lives, who are able to do things that they would not have been able to do in the past. For me, this one is like predominantly a great change in our society, but it comes with a cost for a group like ours, where we had a model that was largely dependent on using unpaid labor from women, which you could argue is a really bad thing in some ways. And we now need to adjust to how we do things, because it's just harder and harder to find people who want to contribute time and are able to attend our events and be a part of community. And that will kind of be the theme over and over throughout this presentation. It's just like, it's getting harder and harder to participate in institutions, and people have more and more skepticism of those institutions. The deinstitutionalization of marriage and family, I think, is a huge trend. This covers a big range of things, but it's basically to say that in the 1950s and 60s, the vast majority of people fit into a pretty small box of like a man and a woman who were married to each other and had a couple of kids. And families really don't fit that pattern at all these days. In many ways, I think our churches are modeled after that old model of family, but there's a huge rise in the number of people who are single parents. Obviously, LGBT people have much more presence in wider social life than they did in the past. Just tons and tons of changes in the ways that we participate in civic life as families. I think it's 25% of people are in single parent situations, so obviously they have less time than they did in the past, they have less energy, it's just a different world, and I don't think our churches have really adapted to responding to those people's circumstances so much as the circumstances of the past. Anyone got something on either of those they want to share? Yeah. I saw 2 hands there. Let's wait for a mic, because I know there's Zoom people.
Smith, back to the slide before. Oh, no, that's the right. What is rise of emerging adulthood?
We're about to talk about that one.
Hi, Thomas Duran here. To the sort of, I guess, question being posed by the economic pressures that people face, and then sort of the requirement that you have less labor working at the church, free labor. I think you have to answer that kind of with a productive church, like in the economic sense, a church that is able to produce and function like how an economy might, separate from, and maybe not separate, but certainly parallel to the existing economy that we live in. And so, like, if you work for a living and all of your household works for a living, you have to have an avenue through the church to produce and support yourself and your community through the church. So the church should provide opportunity. I think ideally, in my mind, the church should provide an opportunity for your labor in the church to actually impact your community and matter in a way that isn't just like, you know, we're getting some cookies together and we're having some tea, and the church is just a place to go and, you know, worship. It should be a community space. It should be a gathering space, and there should be that ability, if especially if you have to answer that question of where do you get the labor from?
Yeah. You and I are right on the same page. Yeah, I mean, if people have less time, they're going to want to see something more dynamic from what they get, and like people are really wanting to see something that makes a big impact. Okay, so emerging adulthood. Probably you have seen this in your lifetime, I would imagine. Again, I grew up in a kind of conservative area, 1990s, but even when I was a teen, there was the widespread cultural expectation that you would turn 18 and you would get a job, or you would go to college and you would get the hell out of the house, and you would not be relying on your parents. That has totally shifted over the last 30 to 40 years. Younger adults take a much longer period of time to kind of get their feet under them and become successful in the way that our society defines that than they used to. There's a number of tons of factors involved in this. You have young adults who are struggling much more with their mental health and are just having trouble getting by in life. But you also have an extension of, educational period and all those things to where even for people who become our societal leaders, it's very normal to be in graduate school until like your mid-30s, to not have gotten married, to not have kids. That's not unusual at all. So for people who are struggling, for people who are really successful, everybody has a longer period of sort of takeoff for adult life than we used to think. That has all sorts of impacts on religious life, on social life. The other one that parallels that is the rise of intensive parenting. Again, conservative area where I grew up, so I think the expectations were a little bit more like the past. Not at all to say they were better, just that they were like the past. But it was still a time where, and I think many of you older folks will relate to this, it was still a time where, I would go out at 8 a.m. and my parents would see me next at like 7 p.m. And there was not a lot of parental supervision. It was go outside, go play, get out there, do your thing. Today, parents have much higher expectations, not just that they be like watching their kid and pay attention to their kid, though you probably see news reports about people who let their 8-year-old kid go out for a walk by themselves and they get the police called on them because the expectations have shifted so much. But also there's an expectation that your kid be in extracurricular education, that they be in all sorts of sports, social activities that you are responsible for getting them to, making sure that they participate in. You're sort of responsible for helping your kids complete their homework in a way that I don't really think was expected of parents a long time ago. There's just much more pressure on parents to be very, very involved and responsible for their kids' lives than there used to be. There's lots of benefits to this. I'm probably much more emotionally connected to my 4-year-old daughter than my grandparents would have been to their kids. I just have a lot of time and opportunity to spend with my kid. That's great. I love it. It does mean I don't have time for other stuff as much as I would if I did not have such an intensive parenting relationship. And that is the norm for younger families these days, which does make it harder for them to be at church, to be involved than it was in the past. So there's some really broad form family changes, but I hope you can see how people are under much more time pressure, or at least a deep perception of the time pressure than they were in the past. Are there questions or thoughts about, there's at least one, I see another one from Scott.
Linda Rocher. I'd like to speak to the intensive parenting. I was talking to some people in their mid-50s, well-established in their careers with a major company, and they were talking about their supervisors who are maybe about 10 years younger, so maybe in their 40s, and they expect them to be on call 24/7 and are texting them about issues that are non-critical that could wait until the next day. So I was asking, I thought younger people were so big on this work-life balance, and they said no. So the emerging adulthood and the intensive parenting is having negative effects, and I think we're just beginning to see that in the business world, in the corporate world, because they also say some of these people that are in their 30s, very intelligent, very capable people, have never been told no. So they'll be in a big meeting and they'll say, well, we need to do such and such, and people more experienced will say, well, it's not feasible to do it that way. And they'll say, but yes, it is. And then they will ask this person to, if they think it's feasible, then the steps to achieve that goal. And they'll say, well, I don't really have those steps, but I know it's possible. So the point being that while there are a lot of advantages, it's like anything, there's good and there's bad. And the bad thing is that it's burning out a lot of these people that are maybe 10, 12 years from retirement that are in a different generation, and they're having trouble dealing in group situations, in dynamics when people expect them to be on call 24/7 and will not take an appropriate no or change for an answer.
Yeah, and I think, we've had statements like change is a constant basically since time immemorial, but these days we are seeing change happen at a much more rapid pace. And your example is a good example of how those changes just kind of pile up on top of each other, and you get people with very different generational experiences, cultural experiences, kind of just running into each other in ways that were less common in the past, and we haven't really adapted ourselves to dealing with those conflicts and challenges very well. And I mean that in a wider social sense. None of our social circles do very well with that. Scott.
Scott Walton. Another group, a demographic group that maybe we should talk about are retired people, because this is a group that's growing. They tend to have resources, and they have more time.
I definitely think we should, but we could have included, along with that rise of intensive parenting, we probably could have also included the rise of intensive grandparenting, because I think it's something like 40% of grandparents are doing childcare multiple times per week for their kids. I know I'm very privileged in that my dad does 4 mornings a week for our family. We probably would not really be able to function like we do if it wasn't for him, but that is becoming more and more normative. And in the 1990s, I think there was a very common pattern where people would retire from their career and then they would move into dedicating a lot of time to the church, and the statistics reflect this. Whereas now retirees are even busier and busier with their other social obligations and have less time to give to the church than they did in the past, just because they're, and the primary thing is they're helping their younger children deal with all the stuff they have to deal with. Okay, any more family change? Questions, comments, pushback? Okay, this is overlapping, but let's talk economic change, which is also huge. So we'll go really far back here on mass consumerism. This is a change that's much wider than the last 70 years. This is something that comes about as capitalism comes about, think 1500s to today. Obviously, most of our religions are based on philosophies, thinkings, faith statements that come from a long time ago. Many of them are about simplicity and self-sacrifice, service to the community, those kinds of things that are in marked contrast to the values of the consumerism that we see today in the world, where you buy your way to an identity. These different products can signal someone that you're a good person if you can afford this, that, and the other, get these vacations, go those places. And I think the number is, so around 1750, all of these numbers are going to be adjusted for inflation, but people in 1750 in the United States had on average the equivalent of $6,000 today. And then if you think about the average number today, I think is $68,000 now today. Our just capacity to consume has increased tremendously. The fundamentals of life are reliant on us having so much more money than we would have had in the past, that spending that is just a normal part of who we are. consumerism in many ways just defines who we are in a way that was very different and unimaginable, even to people in the 1800s, but certainly to the people who helped write the Bible, those early philosophers. It's just a totally different world than how things used to be. So no, we're still going there, Myron. So that mass consumerism change, I think, is so huge, so broad, it's difficult for us to envision. It takes place over a larger period of time. It obviously accelerates as we get to now. Definitely from 1950 today, we see an increase in like how much consumerism defines who we are. And a big part of that is probably best pictured in the rise of neoliberal capitalism. So picture politicians, economists of the 70s and 80s, your Ronald Reagans, your Margaret Thatchers. Capitalism takes on a whole new tenor in this time. It becomes much more aggressive, and there's a desire to lean into the competitiveness of the market in the way that it was definitely present in the past, but not in the same way that it had been for the last 40 or 50 years when unions were on the rise, people were accustomed to staying at the same company for 30 years, their whole career, they got really good benefits from their work overall, and in a way, capitalism and the economy were creating a major stabilizing force in the United States and in our culture. We get to the Thatcher and Reagan era, and that kind of starts to disappear over the next 20 years. People start paying for their own health insurance rather than coming through work. The market is more competitive, so you start to hear more about like what Linda was sharing, where like people are really, really focused on their careers. There starts to be not just a moral, but like an existence prerogative to like really lean into your career to make sure that you survive. It's just a more competitive time. When I was, again, growing up, I was at the tail end of this story. I grew up in Michigan, and I was at the tail end of this story where all the teachers would tell you, you can graduate from high school and you can get a job at the plant and you will be able to afford a house and 2 cars and a place up north. That story is totally gone for younger generations. That just does not exist, and it was kind of a story that was destroyed by this ascendant, much more competitive world that we were starting to see. So any thoughts on consumerism and this rise in competitiveness? Any pushback on any of these?
I think that the rise in consumerism and sort of the bargain that you get with neoliberal capitalism, where you're like, this is as good as it gets, yippee. I'm working with Mark Fisher there. That's where I got that idea. But just like this is as good as it gets, and like, you have to buy your way to this identity. I think that's that Gen Z and the younger generations are not getting better about that. I think we are more consumerist than than it's ever been possible to be. I mean, you can just go onto the social media videos app and then buy stuff through the social media videos app, that's like 3D printed in like sweatshops. It's and for like very little money. And I think that, in large part, our generation does that as a response to sort of the broader economic pressures that we have and the future that we don't see, like the complete sort of despair that we see in the future economically. And so, buying this $2 plastic piece of crap is a balm for that. And so I think this also presents a massive opportunity, not to sound like a recruiter, but like, the ones who are not getting more consumerist are very broken by the consumerism that we see. I feel the same way. I'm sort of drawing from my own experiences and maybe projecting that a little bit, but it is a sort of breaking thing to like get like told, oh, buy all of this, work till you die. It's not good. And I think that sort of the like very simple teachings of Christ, where you say like, he talks a lot about the rich and the poor and how that is not in fact sort of all there is in this life or in the next. Yeah. And so I think that's a very attractive simplicity, and I think that's what draws me to Quakerism, and that's what's drawn a few of my friends to Quakerism as well. It's just the simplicity and the response that it can provide.
You guys should have Thomas do this, because he's spot on. That was great. Definitely, I agree. There's just like younger generations are still very consumeristic, and I do think They are looking for alternatives, but just like you said, people just feel hopeless. They don't feel like there is a meaningful alternative. But if we can start to do things a little bit differently and market ourselves better, the peace, simplicity, all that stuff looks really appealing to younger generations. Okay. I'm going to jump one to speak to Thomas's despair point a little bit, because I do think that's really important. There's a huge number of factors that go into this one, but the essence of this is just younger generations have like no hope that the American dream exists, that capitalism can work for them. That stuff is just kind of dead and buried for them. If you picture from sort of the 90s to today, there was the dot-com bubble, there was the Iraq war drama, then you had the 2008 financial crisis, in which, I think it's difficult for us to imagine how much harm was done in the 2008 financial crisis, but it's like 10 million Americans lost their homes. Like tons of people were deeply affected. I think it's something like $4 trillion in personal wealth was wiped out. Many people who were young in that time, like yours truly, thought, oh, all these companies are getting bailed out, younger people are not. It leads to a huge decline in trust in government, which was already massively on the decline. They think they're doing all the right things, going to college that's going to help them get the good job. Then we see AI on the horizon. Maybe that's not the case. They took out a bunch of debt to be able to get that good job that maybe now isn't there. They run into COVID. They run into Trumpism. It just feels like a very bleak time for younger people. And they have no hope that like doing things right, living the way they're supposed to live by the American standards is actually going to pay off. So when you look back on statistics from like baby boomers where it's like, oh, well, if you work hard, do you think you can have a better life than your ancestors? It's like 85% of people are like, oh, absolutely. You ask that question of younger people today, it's like nobody. It's like 10% of people. So younger people are just very, very hopeless about the future. That's kind of the economic side. There's a whole bunch of other elements to this, talking to younger people about environmental destruction that's happening, the political world. You hear all the time for a litany of reasons, AI, like, I don't really want to bring kids into this world in a way that you would not have heard that among younger or older generations. It's a very bleak time for younger adults. And I'll jump back here just to talk about geographical mobility, because I think this is a huge factor in all of this. I pastor a really small church in rural Ohio, and I have two 90-year-olds in my meeting who have been in their meeting their entire lives and have always lived right there in Ohio. And that was kind of normative for a lot of people in the past, but that is very much a thing of the past. There is less and less of that that's happening. When you look at the statistics for moving, baby boomers moved basically once per decade once they turned 18. It's a little bit more than once. I think it's 1.28 times. And you look at younger generations like millennials, they move almost 3 times per decade. So, I mean, just think about like the logistics of getting yourself connected in a place. They have about 4 years to get connected, and then they're going to move. So like logistically, that's really complicated. When you think of the psychology of a generation that's moving that much, I think it totally shifts things. If you're just thinking, I'm only going to be here for 4 years, why would you bother to get connected to something like this? Like, this is a community that's based on deep connection to each other in the community. They have no expectation as younger generations that they're going to have that. That's just like not something that younger generations experience. Okay, yeah, one question here, and one in the back too.
Well, in all of the presentation, you haven't mentioned the mega church. And that, I think, goes against some of the things that you're saying. And in my life, it's huge.
Tell me a little bit more about what you mean there, just so I'm not responding to something you're not saying.
Millennials drawn to the mega churches. and
Sure.
mega church growing so much that it has, 2 campuses, 5 campuses, 12 campuses, that has 3 balconies plus the main floor, has fireworks going on the stage, not the platform, has a rock band.
Totally. So it's worth noting that those were the groups that were still kind of growing in the 90s, but when you fast forward to today, even they are in very rapid decline. So like that model is not working for them either. But the thing I would really say is the megachurch model is never going to work for Friends. So I don't think we should be like too threatened or focused on that. And while there's definitely younger generations who want and I'll be blunt and kind of offensive here and just saying like, it's kind of a more consumeristic model of church, right? I mean, that's what they offer. There's always going to be some people who want that, but there's a burgeoning resistance to that of younger people who definitely don't want that. And those are the people we're really trying to get. And I do think they're like different categories of people to some degree. I'm sure there's some overlap, but yeah.
The statistic, when my grandchildren were dedicated, there was 2 services with 44 each at each service. No, I'm talking in the mega church.
Yeah, yes.
44 in each service. Yes.
Yes.
So to me, the one issue that I think has to do with economic changes has to do with the fact that there's so many people who are homeless, and at the same time, I think community-wise, churches tended to do a whole lot to prevent that from happening or be involved in that. And maybe one of the reasons why religion is so on the outs is because religion hasn't solved or even tried to solve. Don't seem to be even involved very much in homelessness and that, mass consumerism. I mean, that whole homeless, part of our society is not even part of the consumerist movement, really.
Yeah, and I think there's multiple complicated elements to this, but like definitely there's an element of people think churches are hypocritical because they're not doing enough about big social issues like that. My wife is from Olympia, Washington, and Portland, Oregon, has been very involved in Friends meetings there, and you definitely see like among non-churchgoers, people will like bring that up pretty quickly of like, there's all these people living in hell around here and you don't do anything about it. The other part of this that I think is really challenging is over the last few years, we're seeing like a very marked trend of, and maybe you've read some articles about this, the church becoming kind of a luxury good, and poorer people are like dropping out of church participation at a huge rate. And the majority of people who are left in churches of all sorts are upper middle class people, and there's becoming a big class difference between people who participate in church and people who don't. And that's going to be really hard for us to bridge, and I think one of our primary challenges going forward. Got one there.
My wife and I are obviously of a different generation than many of the people you're talking about, but in our lives we've moved 13 times, and you mentioned that sometimes the reaction to that is, why do I even bother trying to connect? Again, maybe we're the outliers, but we made it a point to connect because we were so desperate for connection. We left our home, we left our family. We want to be a part not just of a new church, but the community itself, and became involved. And I just think there's a real opportunity there. If people are desperate for connection, desperate for meaning in their lives, desperate for some type of spiritual experience, all of these challenges, traumas, whatever that you're sharing with us, and I completely see the validity of that, we can be the answer.
Absolutely. Yeah, you guys are doing a good job of seeing like the positives in a lot of this as well. We have a lot to say to the ways that folks are struggling here as well. I think one thing I'll say is, I mean, there's always variation within these generational statements. They don't cover everybody. And there's obviously some younger people who are trying to respond the way you guys did by like, let's make connection. But there's all these cultural changes, we'll talk about a few of them, have just, younger generations have less and less skills to even know how to do that. Whereas for older generations, there was more organic connection and there was more customs and norms about like, this is what you do. You go out and you make connections in your communities. Whereas for younger generations, it's not normative and they often just don't have the skills to do it, is a reality, I see.
Stan Jones here. Just one little thing I'd like to say about what she was saying about the mega churches. I think there's one thing that they do that is right or good in terms of getting more people involved is they have programs like childcare and preschool and things like that. And I think it would be a little difficult for us here because we're kind of out by ourselves in the middle of fields. But still, I think anything you can do that will bring young people here with their children, their little children, that they need that, and it's something maybe you can do for a little less money than some of the other child care places or something like that, where you can get people interested. They're not coming here for the church, they're coming here for their child care, but they learn to know you and see what you're all about.
I totally agree. Mega churches are like masters of those sort of logistical operations, and like having, you know, other points of contact for your church is really important. And it's also just important to like have opportunities for childcare and stuff on your Sunday mornings as well. The other positive thing I think to say about megachurches is like they're really good at small group stuff, and it's a way people connect a lot more intimately, and that is another area where we could learn to grow and model from them a little bit, but not too much. No fireworks.
I failed to say that yesterday when I met with 3 generations, myself, my kids, and my grandchildren. The reason for that was that I put them all in a group on text. And they started talking with each other and came up with a movie day at my son's house down by Southport Road. And I also have a niece who's in her really early 50s. And I talked to her about Quakerism because she's a child of a Quaker mother, Quaker grandfather. And one of the times I was talking about how the elders go to people's houses when they misbehave and talk them down and always in a loving manner. And she said, well, I need a Quaker like that. And I thought, you know, why not have an Ask a Quaker Elder, you know, call or whatever, you know, man the call, you know, or woman the call, over 24/7, and have this generation is so disconnected and so only talking versus, you know, with the internet, all of a sudden talk to a human voice.
Yeah, I think we have tons of stuff to offer like that. An elder would be great, but like you have all these younger people who are like trying to discern a way forward, struggle with decision making. Like if we were able to offer clearness committees or something to younger people trying to make a difficult decision, I think that would be hugely appealing to younger generations. Okay, any more economic issues or otherwise, whatever's coming up for you? Okay, Myron, why don't you jump us forward to cultural changes here. These are like the broadest types of changes that are kind of nebulous, difficult to get a hold of. I think there's all sorts of really big changes that have come about, so I'm really just going to talk about a few of them. And the first one is just the declining participation in memberships, organizations more broadly. Basically, every kind of membership organization is in decline. Churches are actually in the middle of that, but like every kind you can imagine, whether it's the Lions Club, whether it's something not to insult the Lions Club, something more substantial like a union, there's much less participation. But I was shocked to see that even sports clubs have seen decline over the last 70 years, whereas I see like, isn't that what young families do these days? No, they've had like a 5% decline. And basically this is just to say that people are much less likely to participate in any group, and the biggest reason for that is just people are really uncomfortable with institutions of any kind more than they were in the past. I think past generations also have had like a certain skepticism of institutions, that's natural. But pretty much every younger group of people is deeply skeptical of any kind of institution. And you see that in the numbers. People just don't want to be a part of membership groups. The digital revolution is especially huge and nebulous and difficult to imagine how much it has changed us. I think there's like thousands of ways that it has changed us, but I mean, everybody now has a supercomputer in their pocket that can do whatever they want, including with the rise of AI, seemingly most of our work, almost certainly in the next few years. And we all interact totally differently because of that. Whereas we previously would have had to call somebody or go over to their house, we shoot them a text. Younger people spend all of their time connecting with people across the world, across social media in a way that would have been totally unimaginable to older generations, and there's just a new fluidity to connection that also sometimes leads to a shallowness of connection. So we're probably much more able to communicate with each other in just like a pure ability sense than we ever have been in the past, but we're also totally flooded and overwhelmed with the amount of information, communications that we get, and it leaves us in a place where we're often very shallowly connected. So technology like has all these just unbelievable benefits, but also incredible drawbacks that we just kind of biologically don't seem to be able to handle. Any thoughts on either of those? Pushback on any of that?
Are we on Discord?
Is Fairfield on Discord?
No, we are. I know this congregation is not on Discord.
Okay.
There are Quaker congregations that have Discord channels.
There are definitely Quaker congregations that have Discord channels. We use, what does Western use, Signal right now? Signal. Yeah, we use Signal. So there's all these different apps and modes of communication. So the younger adults in Western, there's a Signal group that they can use to chat. But Discord is yet another app that you can communicate with.
Isn't social media a membership group?
Some of them are, so like there's a Facebook that you would have to ask ahead of time to like be a part of, but other ones definitely not, where it's just like anybody can kind of get on Facebook and start communicating with people, or get on a forum like Reddit, let's say, or God forbid 4chan, start communicating with each other in a way that has no restrictions at all. So like there's different levels of restrictions that we encounter. Few of them in the digital world are as restrictive as membership organizations like a church used to be, where there was like these very stated expectations, and they're kind of, it's more porous and more limited in its expectations now. I mean, push back on that if you want to, but. Like a good example of that is like a reporter being accidentally added to a top secret Signal chat of the US. I mean, it's just like, it's kind of insane how porous those things are these days. That'll never happen. Jeffrey Goldberg never be, yeah. Okay, well this I think is one of the biggest changes, is what sociologists call intensifying expressive individualism, which is in essence just the idea that people increasingly value their self-expression in their lives, in a community space, much more than they would have in the past. So this one cuts across generations. All generations see this huge rise in like, oh, one of the most important parts of being a part of this social group is that I'm able to express myself fully, that there's no restriction on how I express myself, which is something that was much less common in the past and was not really like the core point of social organizations in the past, where that is just markedly on the increase. I I think this idea ties into all sorts of trends, and it especially ties into how younger people view like being religious and being spiritual. Kind of the most important thing to being spiritual, and younger people definitively see like there's a moral obligation tied to this, is like how you start to discover who you are as a person, what you have to offer the world, who you are supposed to be. You have an ethical and moral obligation to explore that and discover that. Obviously, this overlaps with all sorts of things in Christianity and in Quakerism where, you know, God gives us spiritual gifts, or we have special leadings as ministers, as individuals, that if we are being faithful and honest, we do our best to live into. So to me, while this has made it's often difficult to be in communities because of how important this self-expression is to people. They're just less concerned with the cohesion of a group as opposed to being able to express themselves. There's also a ton of opportunity in this for us because like I do think that's foundationally what God is calling to us, is that we be communities where people can learn to be themselves and contribute to the world. But this is becoming, that kind of expressive individualism is just becoming more and more and more important to everybody. So we really need to adapt our systems and structures to work well with that. Thoughts, questions, pushback? We all basically agree with that? Okay, all right. Then let's go to the next slide, which talks about kind of some of the conclusions of these different trends. And obviously I'm really oversimplifying. I mean, even Christian Smith's book is oversimplifying, but if you want a more detailed version, read him. But basically we have people who are busier, or especially they feel busier than they've ever felt. They feel more anxiety and pressure from life than people did in the past. And they're taking longer to settle into stable life, if they ever do, because there's just less economic stability than there used to be. And because of that, they have much less time and much less energy to give to any organization, probably especially a church. Within their lives, the economy is much more of a destabilizing force than it was in, say, the 1940s to the early 2000s. The economy is something that tends to make life more difficult for people in the United States than it used to. And it moves people away from stable community. There's all these ways in which, you know, you're less likely to stay with one job than you used to be. Your job doesn't offer you health insurance, so you're always looking for something that's better. There's just less stability than there used to be. You have a younger people who are really distrustful of institutions. They're really distrustful of any kind of certainty, especially things like faith statements. I hope you're seeing some advantages there for Quakers who don't have explicit faith statements like many groups do. And there's just a much greater focus on self-development and self-expression than there was in the past. Okay, we've got 15 minutes left, which I know we're trying to sing a song and have a little more silence. I do think some silence after this for processing is important. Do people have something that they want to share at this point? Okay, if they don't, I'm going to quickly take you through one more small model thing if you don't have something to share here then. Because I just want to think about the differences that we've encountered as Christians and friends in these cultures over time. So I have 4 sort of like comparative models of what the church was doing. Can you go forward 1 at least, Myron? 1 more. Yeah, this one. Okay, so this is like what the world was in really broad strokes like in Jesus, in Paul's, in the early church's time. So people in the world were really accustomed to looking for the ways that God worked in the world. And I mean, that was much more so than then. So like the Romans believed every river, every tree, every whatever had a spirit. And like the gods were very actively, tangibly working in the world. they were very accustomed to communal interpretations of that. This was not like about individual people's perceptions of this. Like communities made very decisive statements about what, there were people whose official job it was to like, oh, this bird died flying over the city, what does it mean? And they called in the oracle to be like, it meant this. And like people were accustomed to abiding by that communal interpretation. The early church was really focused on this work of dealing with intermixing people, of you have these people, you have Jews who grew up with all these traditions, mixing now with these Greek people who have no exposure to those traditions, and they're trying to figure out what do we keep of those traditions to move forward and be faithful to what Jesus is calling us to do, and what do we let go of so that we can all get along. And they're basically navigating what is God requiring of us. Next one, Myron. This one's looking at the early friends. So still we're at a point where the world is very, what sociologists now call like enchanted. They see the world as God and spirits are working very actively in it. And people are still looking for those. And the people are still very accustomed to a communal interpretation of that. Like at this point, you know, Henry VIII basically tells them what that is, and they go along with it, but that is starting to really break down. And people want to, instead of have this wider communal interpretation that's authoritative, people want to be involved in discerning what that is. And you're seeing interclass conflict, you're seeing much more radical groups demanding to be put to break up this establishment single interpretation of the way things are. And the fundamental navigation is like, okay, who has access to God? Do you need a priest? Who gets to decide what God is saying? And how do we get more involved? Quakers obviously were saying like, everybody has direct access to God. We discern that together as individuals, not as like an authority that tells us. So fast forward to 1960, which is kind of the other inflection points. We're looking the 50s to 60s. The population is used to institutional participation. We're really used to like being a part of the community of God. Everybody's still basically a part of a church. But those big communal interpretations are just like less significant in general. Societal life is not about like interpreting the way spirits have worked. People don't see that as really that relevant of a thing. Most people think God like works in the world, but it's not a spiritual world anymore. People are disenchanted as compared to the past. And people are still like sort of comfortable with authority really broadly. Think like pre-Richard Nixon, there's still some level of trust in the government, but it's kind of tenuous. But people are much more independently minded than they were in the past. And the main fight that's happening is just kind of like some people want to protect this facade of inclusivity, while other people, especially in the civil rights movement, are like really pushing back and saying things are not as good as people are saying it is. And there's a really discernment of like, what is the role of religion in public life? What are we supposed to be doing? That's the main issue we're facing. Should it be socially justice oriented? Should it stay out of it? Should we be a theocracy? And then jumping forward to today, people are really unaccustomed to looking for God's work in the world. People actually don't broadly want to talk about it, to which you see a big reaction where these evangelical people are like, we need the 10 Commandments in schools, we need to be talking about this stuff all the time. They try to make it front and center, and then most of the rest of the population is like, no, I don't want to, we should not be talking about these things. We are much more individualistic. We're not very good at like communal life in general, and everybody just has this huge distrust of authority in general. So we have really there's a bitter argument about what role religion should play in public life at all, and we are now navigating just a huge number of generational and political differences about religion, and we don't really know how to do that because we're so divided and have such diverse views. So it's just a way of looking at the different struggles the church has dealt with. I think there's many parallels for us between like today and the early church's days, where we have people who are accustomed to all these traditions of like, this is what church does, this is what Quakerism is, and people who have no exposure to those things at all. And if we want to live, we're going to have to incorporate those people who have no exposure at all, and that means we're going to have to like change a lot of what we do to adapt to those new people. Does anybody have something they're like burning to share before we take a little bit of silence and then sing a song? I got Thomas again, all right.
The 4 little transitionary things at the end made me think about the Shakers and how I forget her name. I think it was Anne.
I can't remember either, but yeah.
Anne Lee.
Yeah.
The charismatic leader of the Shakers. She, got all of this attention and all of this attraction towards the Shakers, and I mean, so much so that, hey, we're never going to have kids. It doesn't matter. And so she, collects all of these people together into this faith, congregates them, and then she dies. The end times do not come, and the faith has to settle down, and there has to be this change where you take, and this is sort of a sociological view of it, but the shift happened in that you no longer had the charismatic leader, and you had to institutionalize the traditions and the practices of the Shakers. And so from there, the faith changed. It was no longer about what it was when Anne was in charge of it, and I'm wondering if that sort of change and that shift is something that Quakers need to be looking at as well, because maybe it's not necessarily a settling down, but rather a sort of standing up of the faith.
I do think it's like a similarly gigantic shift of especially with the way AI is going to change the world. We are struggling to deal with these older set of changes, and we are about to have a much larger set of changes, and we are going to have to pretty radically shift ourselves and change to adapt to that brave new world. Okay. Well, I appreciate being able to talk to you. Like I said, this is kind of the downer day. It will be less of a downer as we go forward, and we'll think about ways that we can adapt to this world. The next time we meet, we're really going to talk about Fairfield specifically and try to dig into its history and learn a little bit more about the past, and then we'll start looking to the future as we go forward. So let's enter into a few minutes of silence here, and then we will sing a song.
Tom, thank you very much. You've given us much to think about. For our last hymn, we're going to sing in worship and song, 245, How Can I Keep From Singing? And I appreciate anybody that wants to come up and gather our food as we share our abundance with them. We also have collection plates in the back of the room for anybody that wants to give that way. So let's stand as you're able and sing on 245. invite you to stay for our pitch-in. If you didn't bring anything, don't worry about it. There's plenty of food out there, so please. And another thing to remind you about is out there's a board that we're signing up for what we're going to bring to our bicentennial dinner, which will be the September the 13th, so keep that in mind. We have lots of things coming up, so please turn and greet your neighbor.